The morning sun was just peeking through the airport windows as Mr. Johnson checked his watch one more time. He had arrived 3 hours early for his flight to Seattle, where he was supposed to give a presentation about the latest developments in aircraft safety systems. After 15 years of working as an aerospace engineer and contributing to major aviation safety improvements, he knew the importance of being punctual. Standing in line at the first-class check-in counter, he adjusted his navy blue suit and double-checked his presentation materials on his tablet. The conference he was heading to could open new doors for his research on hydraulic system improvements. He couldn't help but smile, thinking about how his grandmother would have been proud to see him now, from a kid who used to build paper airplanes in their small apartment to an engineer whose work helped keep thousands of passengers safe. As he approached the counter, the attendant's welcoming smile faded slightly. She glanced at his first-class ticket, then back at him, her eyebrows rising. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" "Economy check-in is over there," she said, pointing to a longer queue across the terminal. "Yes, I'm sure," Mr. Johnson replied calmly, sliding his first-class ticket and ID across the counter. He'd been through this before, too many times to count. The attendant examined his ticket with unusual scrutiny, turning it over several times as if expecting to find something wrong. After finally getting his boarding pass, Mr. Johnson made his way through security and to his gate. While waiting to board, he pulled out his phone to review some technical specifications he'd been working on. A young boy sitting nearby noticed the complex diagrams on his screen and asked, "Are those airplanes?" Mr. Johnson smiled warmly, happy to explain his work to an interested mind. "Yes, these are aircraft systems. I help make sure planes fly safely." The boy's eyes lit up with curiosity, and for a few minutes, Mr. Johnson forgot about the uncomfortable check-in experience as he answered the child's eager questions about how planes stay in the air. The boarding process started, and Mr. Johnson waited patiently for his group to be called. When he approached the gate, the flight attendant checking passes did a double take. "First class?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of disbelief. "Could I see your boarding pass again?" Once aboard, another flight attendant stopped him in the first-class cabin. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion. Could you verify your seat number?" Mr. Johnson took a deep breath and once again showed his boarding pass. He settled into his seat, pulling out his tablet to distract himself from the whispered conversations and sideways glances from the cabin crew. An elderly passenger across the aisle caught his eye and gave him a knowing, sympathetic smile. Mr. Johnson nodded in return, appreciating the small gesture of understanding. As he opened his presentation slides, he couldn't help but think about how many times he'd been in similar situations. But he'd learned long ago that the best response was to stay professional and focused on his work. Little did anyone on that flight know that in a few hours, all their preconceptions would be challenged in a way none of them could have imagined. Mr. Johnson gazed out the window as the plane began to push back from the gate, unaware that this routine flight would soon turn into one of the most intense experiences of his life. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign had just turned off when the first round of drink service began. Mr. Johnson was reviewing his presentation one last time, making small notes in the margins about possible questions that might come up during the conference. A flight attendant stopped at his row, her smile noticeably tighter than the one she'd given to other first-class passengers. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of reluctance. Before he could answer, she quickly added, "The complimentary beverages in first class are quite expensive." "Just water, please," Mr. Johnson replied quietly, used to these subtle implications. As she poured his water, her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops on his tablet. She didn't apologize, quickly moving to the next passenger with a much warmer demeanor. The passenger next to him, a businessman in his 50s, had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. He cleared his throat and spoke up. "I couldn't help but notice. That wasn't right, how she treated you." Mr. Johnson gave a small smile. "It happens more often than you'd think," he said, carefully wiping his tablet with a napkin. "I've learned to focus on what matters, my work, my contributions to aviation safety." A senior flight attendant passed by, pausing when she saw Mr. Johnson's open tablet displaying complex engineering diagrams. "Sir," she said with an edge in her voice, "we need to verify your seating assignment again. There seems to be some confusion about your ticket. The businessman next to him spoke up again. Is this really necessary? He's already shown his boarding pass twice. The senior flight attendant's face flushed slightly. It's just standard procedure, she insisted, though everyone knew it wasn't. Mr. Johnson calmly reached for his boarding pass again, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing discomfort of the situation. As he handed over his ticket, he noticed something odd. A slight vibration in the floor that shouldn't have been there. His engineering instincts kicked in, but he pushed the concern aside for the moment, dealing with the immediate situation at hand. The senior flight attendant examined his ticket with exaggerated thoroughness before suggesting, "You might be more comfortable in economy class. We could arrange a seat change if you prefer." Her tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you," Mr. Johnson replied firmly but politely. "I selected this seat specifically to work on my presentation for tomorrow's Aerospace Engineering Conference." A few nearby passengers had started watching the exchange, some with disapproval directed at the flight attendant's behavior, others pretending not to notice. The businessman beside him shook his head in disgust at the situation. Mr. Johnson returned to his work, but that strange vibration was becoming more noticeable. His years of experience in aircraft systems were telling him something wasn't quite right. He glanced out the window at the left engine, then back at his tablet where he had detailed schematics of similar aircraft systems. The vibration pattern was familiar. He'd written a paper about similar symptoms in hydraulic systems just last year. But when he tried to catch the attention of a passing flight attendant to mention his concerns, she deliberately looked away, quickening her pace. Little did they know that their biases were about to put them in a situation where they'd have to confront their prejudices head-on. As the plane continued its journey westward, that subtle vibration was slowly developing into something that would soon test everyone on board and force them to reconsider their hasty judgments. 3 hours into the flight, the vibration that Mr. Johnson had noticed earlier was becoming impossible to ignore. The slight tremor had grown into a rhythmic shudder that made the ice in passengers' drinks clink against their plastic cups. His trained ear picked up a change in the engine's pitch, a subtle but worrying difference that made him sit up straighter in his seat. He pulled up the aircraft schematics on his tablet again, comparing the symptoms he was observing with his research findings. The pattern matched a serious hydraulic system issue he'd documented in his recent paper. His heart rate quickened as he realized the potential implications. "Excuse me," he called out to a passing flight attendant, the same one who had questioned his seating earlier. "I need to speak with the flight crew about something urgent." She barely slowed her pace. "Sir, please remain in your seat. If you need assistance, use the call button." "You don't understand," he persisted, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I'm an aerospace engineer, and I'm detecting signs of a potential hydraulic system malfunction. It needs immediate attention." The flight attendant's expression shifted from dismissal to irritation. "Sir, please let the professionals handle the aircraft. We have highly trained pilots in the cockpit." The businessman next to him spoke up again. "Maybe you should listen to him. He's been working with these systems for years." But the flight attendant had already walked away, whispering something to her colleague while glancing back at Mr. Johnson with obvious skepticism. He pressed his call button, determined to get someone to listen. A different flight attendant approached, looking annoyed. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes, there's a serious problem with the aircraft hydraulic system. I can explain the technical details, but first, I need you to relay this information to the cockpit." He showed her the diagrams on his tablet, pointing out the specific components he suspected were failing. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I assure you our maintenance team thoroughly checked the aircraft before takeoff. Please remain in your seat and let the professionals handle things." Just then, the plane shuddered more violently than before. Several passengers gasped as their drinks spilled, the cabin lights flickered briefly, and the distinctive whine of the engines changed pitch again, this time loud enough for everyone to notice. Mr. Johnson quickly saved his work and secured his tablet, knowing things were about to get worse. He could feel the aircraft's handling changing subtly, something most passengers wouldn't notice, but was glaringly obvious to someone with his experience. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, trying to sound calm but carrying an edge of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence." Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. But Mr. Johnson knew this wasn't turbulence. The symptoms were getting worse, matching almost exactly with the cascade failure pattern he documented in his research. He looked out the window at the left engine again, noticing small but telling signs that confirmed his suspicions. An off-duty pilot sitting a few rows back had also noticed something was wrong. Mr. Johnson could see him speaking urgently with one of the flight attendants, gesturing toward the cockpit. Maybe now they would finally listen to his concerns before the situation became critical. The plane lurched again, stronger this time. A bag fell from an overhead compartment, and the quiet murmur of concerned passengers grew louder. The same flight attendants who had dismissed him earlier were now moving quickly through the cabin, their faces tense as they checked seatbelts and secured loose items. What happened next would test not only the crew's ability to handle a crisis, but also their willingness to look past their prejudices when lives were at stake. The real question was, would they be able to swallow their pride in time to prevent a potential disaster? The situation deteriorated rapidly. The plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to scream. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swaying with the aircraft's violent movements. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with undisguised urgency. "This is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a technical difficulty and will be making an emergency descent. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." Mr. Johnson knew exactly what was happening. The hydraulic system was failing exactly as his research had predicted. First the supple vibrations, then the engine pitch changes, and now the loss of altitude control. He quickly secured his oxygen mask and helped the elderly passenger across the aisle with hers, staying remarkably composed despite the chaos around him. The businessman next to him clutched his armrests, knuckles white with fear. "What's happening?" he asked, voice shaking. "The hydraulic system is failing," Mr. Johnson explained calmly while fastening the businessman's mask. "It controls crucial flight surfaces, but there's a way to handle this. I wrote a paper on it last year." A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle as the plane shuddered again. The same one who had repeatedly dismissed Mr. Johnson now looked at him with a mix of fear and desperation. The off-duty pilot from the back had made his way to their section, gripping the seats for balance. "The cockpit's reporting multiple system failures," the off-duty pilot announced grimly. "They're struggling to maintain control." The plane banked sharply to the left, causing loose items to slide across the cabin floor. Through the window, Mr. Johnson could see the left engine was now showing visible signs of distress. Warning lights flashed throughout the cabin, and the air grew noticeably thinner despite the oxygen masks. Several children were crying, and a woman a few rows back was having what appeared to be a panic attack. The flight attendants, who had been so confident in dismissing Mr. Johnson earlier, now moved through the cabin with visible fear on their faces, trying their best to maintain order. The intercom crackled again. "If there's anyone on board with engineering experience, particularly in aircraft systems, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately." The same flight attendant who had told him to let the professionals handle things now stood in the aisle, scanning the cabin desperately. Mr. Johnson raised his hand, maintaining eye contact with her. The moment of recognition in her eyes spoke volumes, shame, hope, and urgency all mixed together. "I can help," he said simply, removing his oxygen mask momentarily to speak clearly. "But you need to get me to the cockpit now." The off-duty pilot stepped forward. "I'll vouch for him. I've been watching him track this problem since it started. He knew something was wrong before any of us did." The plane dropped again, this time more severely. Drinks, books, and tablets hit the ceiling before raining down on passengers. The cabin lights flickered ominously, and the engine sound became even more irregular. As the flight attendant helped Mr. Johnson out of his seat, he grabbed his tablet with the crucial research data. The same crew members who had questioned his presence in first class now formed a human chain to help him make his way to the cockpit through the violently shaking aircraft. Time was running out. The plane was losing altitude rapidly, and the systems were failing in sequence. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to save everyone on board, if the crew could put aside their biases long enough to listen to the very person they had spent hours dismissing. The cockpit door opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, and both pilots were struggling with the controls. The captain glanced quickly at Mr. Johnson, his face tense but professional. "You're the engineer?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Johnson replied, already studying the instrument readings. "I've researched this exact failure pattern. May I?" He gestured to his tablet, and the captain nodded quickly. Mr. Johnson pulled up his research diagrams, speaking clearly and confidently despite the continued turbulence. "The primary hydraulic system is failing, but there's a backup procedure I helped develop. We need to reroute power from the auxiliary systems and manually override the primary controls." The co-pilot looked skeptical. "That's not in any of our emergency procedures." "Because it's new research," Mr. Johnson explained, keeping his voice steady as the plane shuddered again. "I was actually heading to Seattle to present these findings. The traditional emergency procedures won't work here. They don't account for this specific failure pattern." The plane dropped another 1,000 feet, causing everyone in the cockpit to grab for support. The flight attendant who had escorted Mr. Johnson up stood in the doorway, watching with a mix of fear and hope. "We're losing altitude too fast," the captain said, his voice strained. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Mr. Johnson quickly walked them through the procedure, his tablet displaying the crucial diagrams. "First, we need to shut down the left engine completely. It's making things worse. Then redirect power to the auxiliary hydraulic pump, but in a specific sequence." The pilots exchanged glances, then the captain made his decision. "Do it. Talk us through it step by step." Working together, they began implementing the emergency protocol. Mr. Johnson's voice remained calm and clear as he guided them through each critical step. "Now reduce power to 70%. Wait 3 seconds. Now redirect auxiliary power." The plane was still shaking, but as they followed his instructions, the violent movements began to decrease. Warning lights started going dark one by one. The cabin's pitching motions gradually stabilized. "It's working," the co-pilot said, amazement clear in his voice. "The system's responding." "We're still going to need to make an emergency landing," Mr. Johnson advised, showing them another diagram. "The backup system will hold, but we need to get on the ground as soon as possible. Denver's our best option. They have the longest runway and the best emergency response team." The captain nodded, already radioing air traffic control. The flight attendant who had dismissed Mr. Johnson earlier now watched him work with undisguised awe and respect. The same professional she had tried to remove from first class was now calmly saving all their lives. "Denver's clearing a runway for us," the captain announced. "They'll have emergency crews standing by. Can you stay and help us through the landing?" "Of course," Mr. Johnson replied, already pulling up the relevant landing procedures on his tablet. "We'll need to adjust the approach speed and angle to compensate for the compromised hydraulics. I can show you exactly how." As they began coordinating with Denver Air Traffic Control, the atmosphere in the cockpit had completely transformed. The same expertise that had been dismissed hours earlier was now being heard with rapt attention. Every suggestion Mr. Johnson made was immediately acknowledged and implemented. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that cockpit, how quickly prejudices could fade when lives were on the line. But there would be time to reflect on that later. Right now, they had a plane full of passengers counting on them to get safely on the ground. The lights of Denver International Airport came into view through the cockpit windows. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their lights flashing in the darkness. Inside the plane, Mr. Johnson worked steadily with the flight crew, guiding them through the modified landing procedures. "We'll need to come in at a shallower angle than normal," he explained, showing the pilots a diagram on his tablet. "The compromised hydraulics mean we can't risk too much stress on the landing gear." The captain nodded, his hands steady on the controls. "Air traffic control has cleared all other traffic. We have the entire airport to ourselves." Through the cabin's intercom, the co-pilot's voice remained remarkably calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Denver. Please remain in your brace positions until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." Mr. Johnson monitored the system readings closely. "Looking good so far. Remember, we'll have reduced brake efficiency, so we'll need most of the runway length." The plane descended slowly, more steadily now thanks to the backup procedures they'd implemented. In the cabin, passengers held their breath, many praying quietly. The flight attendants, now models of professionalism, moved through the cabin one last time, ensuring everyone was properly positioned. 1,000 feet, the co-pilot called out. The runway approached, growing larger in the windscreen. 500 feet, Mr. Johnson watched the hydraulic pressure readings carefully. Systems are holding steady. 200 feet, the landing gear deployed with a reassuring thunk. 100 feet, everyone in the cockpit focused intently on their tasks. The wheels touched down with a surprisingly gentle bump, far smoother than anyone had dared hope for. But they weren't safe yet. The real challenge would be stopping the massive aircraft with their compromised systems. Deploying thrust reversers, the captain announced, his voice tense with concentration. The plane shuddered as the engines roared in reverse. Mr. Johnson kept his eyes on the system readings. Brake pressure holding. We're good to apply more force. The plane rolled down the runway, gradually slowing. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, ready to respond if needed. The passengers stayed silent, still holding their breath, still in their brace positions. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the aircraft came to a complete stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the captain let out a long breath and turned to Mr. Johnson. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. The co-pilot was already radioing the tower, Flight 2317, safely on the ground, all systems secured, requesting immediate passenger evacuation procedures. Emergency crews surrounded the plane as the flight attendants began the evacuation process. The same senior attendant who had suggested Mr. Johnson move to economy class now stood nearby, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We were so wrong about you." Mr. Johnson simply nodded, his focus still on helping coordinate the evacuation. As passengers moved toward the emergency slides, many stopped to thank him, having heard during the crisis that an engineer had helped save the plane. The businessman from first class gripped his hand firmly, unable to speak through his emotions. In the end, all 238 passengers and crew members evacuated safely. They gathered in the airport terminal, many still shaking, all grateful to be alive. The incident that had started with prejudice and dismissal had ended with a powerful lesson about judgment and expertise. The story of Flight 2317 hit the news networks the next morning. Headlines across the country told the tale of how an engineer saved a plane full of passengers after being discriminated against by the very crew he would later help save. Airport security footage of the emergency landing went viral, showing the plane's careful touchdown with emergency vehicles racing alongside. In the days that followed, Mr. Johnson received hundreds of messages from people around the world. Parents wrote to tell him their children now wanted to become engineers because of his story. Young professionals shared their own experiences with workplace discrimination and thanked him for showing such grace under pressure. The airline's CEO personally called to apologize for the treatment he had received. "Your experience has opened our eyes," the CEO admitted during a press conference. "We're implementing immediate changes to our training programs." The airline announced a comprehensive review of their customer service policies and launched a new staff training program focused on eliminating unconscious bias. The businessman from first class wrote a detailed account of what he had witnessed, which was published in several major newspapers. His perspective as someone who watched the discrimination unfold and then saw the same man save everyone's lives resonated deeply with readers. A week after the incident, the Federal Aviation Administration held a special ceremony to honor Mr. Johnson's actions. The same flight attendants who had doubted him attended the ceremony, having requested to be there. When he stepped up to receive his award, they were among the first to stand and applaud. During his acceptance speech, Mr. Johnson spoke about more than just the technical aspects of what happened. "Engineering taught me to look past the surface and understand the deeper workings of things," he said. "Maybe that's a lesson we could all use in how we treat each other." The incident sparked important conversations across the aviation industry. Airlines began reviewing their hiring practices and customer service protocols. Engineering schools used the story to discuss not only the technical aspects of the emergency landing, but also the human elements of professional respect and dignity. The young boy who had talked with Mr. Johnson at the airport before the flight appeared on a morning news show with his parents. "He told me anyone could be an engineer if they worked hard," the boy said, clutching a toy airplane. "He was right. It doesn't matter what you look like. Several months later, Mr. Johnson finally delivered his presentation about aircraft safety systems to a much larger audience than originally planned. The conference hall was packed with aviation professionals eager to learn from his expertise. The same hydraulic system modification that had saved Flight 2317 was fast-tracked for implementation across the industry. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in the form of a new scholarship program the airline established in Mr. Johnson's honor. The program would support underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation and aerospace engineering. True safety comes not just from good engineering, Mr. Johnson said at the scholarship launch, but from creating an industry where every voice is heard and every expert is respected. 1 year after the incident, many of the passengers from Flight 2317 gathered for a reunion. They shared stories, hugged, and reflected on how that challenging day had changed their perspectives. The flight attendants who had once shown such prejudice now helped organize the event, standing as examples of how people can learn and grow from their mistakes.